I've been driving 18-wheelers for over 20 years, and I thought I'd seen everything the road could throw at me. Weather, breakdowns, crazy drivers, you name it. But what happened to me at Richardson's Truck Haven last month still keeps me up at night. I'm posting this here because I need to get it off my chest, and maybe someone else has experienced something similar. I don't expect everyone to believe me, but I swear on my mother's grave that every word of this is true. My name is Warren Mitchell, and I drive routes mainly through the Midwest. September 19th started like any other day. I was hauling a load of auto parts from Detroit to Kansas City when my engine started making this god-awful grinding noise about 50 miles outside of Springfield. The temperature gauge was climbing fast, and I knew I had to pull over before I blew the whole damn thing. That's when I saw the sign for Richardson's Truck Haven, one of those old-school truck stops that's been around since the 70s. The place looked run down, but it had a mechanic shop and a small motel attached, which was exactly what I needed. I pulled into the lot around 6 p.m., and the place felt like it was stuck in time. The neon sign was flickering, half the letters burned out, and there were only 3 other rigs parked there. The main building was this faded yellow concrete block structure with a diner on one side and the motel office on the other. I walked into the office, and this elderly woman named Doris was behind the counter, probably in her 70s, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She had this look about her, like she'd seen too much over the years. When I explained my situation, she told me their mechanic wouldn't be in until morning, but I could get a room for the night and he'd take a look at my rig first thing. The rooms were only $35, which seemed reasonable enough. She handed me a key attached to a plastic tag with the number 36 on it. "End unit," she said, barely looking up from her paperwork. "Quiet spot." I thanked her, grabbed my overnight bag from the cab, and headed to what I thought would be just another forgettable night in another forgettable motel room. Room 36 was at the far end of the motel, separated from the other units by about 20 feet. The building was that typical 70s architecture, single story, doors facing the parking lot, each room with a big window next to the door. As I walked up, I noticed the paint was peeling pretty badly around my door, and there were these weird dark stains on the concrete walkway that looked like they'd been there for decades. The key stuck in the lock at first, and I had to jiggle it around before it finally turned. The room smelled musty, like it hadn't been used in a while, with that old carpet smell mixed with something else I couldn't quite place. It was basic: 2 double beds with faded floral bedspreads, a small table with 2 chairs, an old TV on a dresser, and a bathroom that had seen better days. What struck me as odd was how cold it was inside. I mean, it was September, still pretty warm outside, maybe 75 degrees, but this room felt like they had the AC cranked to the max. I checked the thermostat on the wall, and it was actually set to 78 degrees, but the little display showed it was only 62 in the room. I dropped my bag on the bed closest to the door and went to mess with the thermostat, thinking maybe it was broken. No matter what I did, turning it up to 80, switching it to heat, even turning it completely off, nothing changed. The room just kept getting colder. I could actually see my breath starting to fog up a little bit, which was completely insane. I figured maybe there was something wrong with the unit, so I decided to tough it out for one night. I was tired, hungry, and just wanted to grab some dinner from the diner and get some sleep before dealing with my truck in the morning. But as I was unpacking my few things, I noticed something that definitely hadn't been there when I first walked in. Sitting on the small table was this old radio, not like a modern digital clock radio, but one of those vintage wooden ones from maybe the 40s or 50s. It was plugged into the wall, and the cord looked newer than the radio itself, like someone had recently replaced it. The strange thing was, Doris hadn't mentioned anything about a radio being in the room, and it definitely wasn't there when I first looked around. I stared at that radio for a good minute, trying to figure out if I'd somehow missed it when I first came in. But I'm pretty observant, comes with the territory when you're driving for a living, and I was sure it hadn't been there. The thing looked like it belonged in a museum, with this dark wood finish and chrome dials that had that old-fashioned Art Deco style. I walked over and unplugged it, thinking maybe housekeeping had left it behind by mistake. But even unplugged, the damn thing felt ice cold to the touch, colder than everything else in the already freezing room. I plugged it back in and noticed the dial was set to what looked like a CB frequency, which was weird because most old radios like that didn't pick up CB channels. I left it alone and headed to the diner for some food, but the whole walk over I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this place. The few people I saw, a couple of other truckers, some locals at the counter, they all seemed normal enough, but there was this atmosphere, Like everyone was trying a little too hard to act casual, I grabbed a burger and fries and was back in my room by about 8:30. The temperature had dropped even more. I swear it couldn't have been more than 55 degrees in there by then. I was wearing a heavy flannel shirt and still shivering. I tried calling the front desk to complain about the AC, but the phone in the room was dead. No dial tone, nothing. So I bundled up in the extra blanket from the closet and settled in to watch some TV, trying to ignore how my breath was now clearly visible every time I exhaled. That's when the radio came on by itself. I'm not talking about some gradual static building up or anything like that. The thing just suddenly came to life with this loud pop, like someone had turned the volume all the way up. The sound that came out wasn't music or a normal radio station. It was that distinctive CB radio sound. You know, that slightly distorted, scratchy quality you get with trucker communications. And what I heard next made my blood run cold. A man's voice, panicked and desperate, was calling for help. "Mayday, mayday, this is Howard in room 36 at Richardson's Truck Haven. Something's wrong here. Something's really wrong. The temperature just dropped like crazy and I can't get out. Can anyone hear me? I need help in room 36. I jumped up from the bed so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. My heart was pounding as I stared at that radio, but the voice had stopped. Just static now. That low hissing sound that old radios make between stations. I reached over and turned the volume down, my hands shaking. Whether from cold or fear, I couldn't tell anymore. The whole thing had to be some kind of recording, maybe a prank the motel played on guests, though that seemed pretty sick even for a rundown place like this. But the voice had said room 36 specifically, and it sounded so real, so genuinely terrified. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was picking up some old CB transmission, some kind of atmospheric thing where radio waves bounce around for years before finding a receiver. I'd heard truckers talk about stuff like that before, but never experienced it myself. I unplugged the radio again, and this time I moved it to the far corner of the room, as far from me as possible. The silence that followed was almost worse than the voice had been. All I could hear was my own breathing, and the faint hum of that broken air conditioning unit that was turning my room into a freezer. I was just starting to calm down, telling myself it was all some weird coincidence, when I heard footsteps outside my door. Slow, deliberate steps on the concrete walkway, getting closer. Then 3 sharp knocks. I looked through the peephole but couldn't see anyone. The parking lot light was dim and flickering. "Yeah?" I called out, not opening the door. A man's voice answered, muffled but clear enough. "Hey there, I heard your CB call for help. You said you were in room 36? My stomach dropped. I hadn't made any CB call. I didn't even have a CB radio with me. Mine was built into my truck, and my truck was parked way across the lot near the garage. "I think you got the wrong room, buddy," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But the guy outside wasn't giving up. No, I heard it clear as day. "Howard, right? You said something was wrong in room 36. I'm parked just a few spots over. Saw your rig with the Michigan plates. Name's Warren Mitchell, isn't it?" I felt like someone had just punched me in the gut. This stranger knew my name, knew my truck, but he'd called me Howard, and somehow thought I was the one who'd made that radio call for help. I backed away from the door, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. "Look, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but my name's Warren, not Howard," I said through the door, my voice probably giving away how spooked I was getting. "And I didn't make any CB call." There was a long pause, then I heard the footsteps moving away. But instead of relief, I felt even more uneasy. Something was seriously wrong here, and I needed answers. I threw on my jacket. The room had to be down to the 40s by now, and headed straight for the motel office. Doris was still there, reading a paperback novel behind the counter under a dim fluorescent light. When I walked in, she looked up with this expression like she'd been expecting me. "Room 36 giving you trouble?" she asked before I could even open my mouth. The way she said it, so matter-of-fact, made my skin crawl. "Yeah, the AC's broken or something. It's freezing in there. And there's this old radio that wasn't there when I checked in, and someone just came to my door asking about a CB call I never made." Doris closed her book slowly and looked at me with these tired, sad eyes. "What did the radio say exactly?" she asked. When I told her about the voice calling for help from room 36, asking for Howard, her face went pale. "Son, I think you need to sit down," Doris said, gesturing to an old vinyl chair next to a coffee table covered in trucking magazines. Room 36 has a history, and September 19th, she paused and looked at the calendar on the wall behind her. Today's September 19th, isn't it? I nodded, not liking where this was going. 47 years ago today, we had a trucker named Howard Welch staying in that room. Nice guy, been driving for about 15 years. Had a wife and 2 kids back in Ohio. He checked in that evening, just like you did, because his rig had broken down. Doris's voice got quieter, like she was telling a ghost story, except I was getting the horrible feeling this wasn't just a story. Around 9 o'clock that night, Howard called the front desk in a panic, said his room had gotten ice cold all of a sudden, and he couldn't get the door to open. We didn't have cell phones back then, but Howard had his CB radio with him. He was calling for help on the airwaves, giving out our location, saying he was trapped in room 36. My blood felt like it was turning to ice as she continued. By the time we got maintenance to break down the door, Howard was dead. Heart attack, the coroner said. But here's the thing that still gives me nightmares. There was frost on the windows from the inside, and his breath was visible in the air like it was the middle of winter. Ever since that night, Doris continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Room 36 gets rented maybe once or twice a year, and it's always the same story. The temperature drops, that old radio appears. We've thrown it away dozens of times, but it keeps coming back, and Howard's voice comes through, calling for help just like he did that night. She looked directly at me, and I could see she was dead serious. Most folks just think it's the AC acting up and check out early, but every few years, someone stays long enough to hear the whole thing play out. And it's always truckers, always guys whose names start with the same letters as Howard's. We've had a Henry, a Harold, a Harvey, and now Warren. I felt sick to my stomach. Why didn't you tell me this when I checked in? I asked, but she just shook her head. Would you have believed me? And besides, most of the time nothing happens. It's just that tonight. She trailed off and looked at the calendar again. Tonight's the anniversary, and it's always worse on the anniversary. I wanted to demand a different room, but something in her expression told me it might be too late for that. The radio, I said. It's not just playing back what happened to Howard, is it? Someone outside my door knew my name, called me Howard, said they heard my CB call for help. Doris nodded grimly. That's when you know it's really happening. When the boundary gets thin and the past starts bleeding through into the present. Howard's still there somehow, still calling for help, but now he's pulling others into it. She stood up and walked to a filing cabinet, pulling out a thick folder. I've been keeping records for years, trying to understand it. Every time it happens, the temperature in that room drops to exactly 32 degrees, freezing, and stays there until sunrise. The radio always tunes itself to channel 19, Howard's favorite CB frequency. And anyone who stays in the room long enough starts to, well, they start to become part of his story. My hands were shaking as I asked, "What do you mean, become part of his story?" She opened the folder and showed me Polaroid pictures of the room taken over the years, ice crystals on the windows, frost covering the furniture, and in some of the more recent photos, you could see 2 shadows on the wall instead of 1. Howard died alone and scared, calling for help that never came. I think part of him is still trying to get that help, and he's reaching out to anyone who'll listen. The problem is, once you hear his voice, once you respond to his call, you become connected to what happened that night. I stared at those photos, my mind trying to reject what I was seeing, but the evidence was right there in black and white. In the most recent photo, dated just 2 years ago, you could clearly see frost covering every surface in room 36, and there were definitely 2 distinct shadows on the wall, one shorter, one taller, both human-shaped. What happened to the guy who took this picture? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Jerry Hoffman, trucker from Nevada. He made it through the night, but barely. Said the temperature kept dropping until he could see ice forming on his skin. Around 3 in the morning, he saw Howard, or what was left of him, standing in the corner of the room, just staring at him with these desperate, pleading eyes. Doris closed the folder and looked at me with genuine concern. Jerry was lucky. He had a strong heart and managed to stay calm. But others, she trailed off. Others weren't so fortunate. I felt like I was going to throw up. So what am I supposed to do? Just pack up and leave? She shook her head. It's too late for that now. Once Howard's made contact, once he knows you're there, leaving the room won't help. The connection follows you. Your best bet is to go back, stay warm as you can, and try to help him find peace. I walked back to room 36 in a daze, every step feeling like I was walking toward my own grave. The temperature outside had dropped with the sun, but it still felt tropical compared to what was waiting for me behind that door. As I slid the key into the lock, I noticed my breath was already fogging up and I wasn't even inside yet. The door opened with a creak that sounded like something out of a horror movie, and the wave of cold air that hit me was so intense it actually hurt. The room was now colder than any winter night I'd ever experienced, and I could see frost starting to form on the mirror above the dresser. That damn radio was back on the table where I'd originally found it, plugged in, the dial glowing softly in the dim light. I closed the door behind me and immediately heard the lock click. Not the normal sound of a door latch, but something deeper, more final, like a prison cell slamming shut. When I tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. I was trapped, just like Howard had been 47 years ago. And as if on cue, the radio crackled to life again. But this time, the voice was different. It was still desperate, still calling for help from room 36. But now it was calling my name instead of Howard's. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Warren in room 36 at Richardson's Truck Haven," the voice coming from the radio said, and I felt my knees nearly give out because it was my voice. Not similar to mine, not close. It was exactly my voice, with my accent, my speech patterns, everything. Something's wrong here. Temperature's dropping fast and the door won't open. "Can anyone hear me? I need help in room 36. I stumbled backward, hitting the wall, staring at that radio in complete terror. I hadn't said those words, I wasn't anywhere near the radio, but somehow it was broadcasting my voice asking for help. The room was getting so cold now that ice was actually forming on the inside of the windows, creating these intricate frost patterns that looked almost like reaching hands. I could feel the cold seeping through my clothes, through my skin, settling into my bones. My teeth were chattering so hard I could barely think straight. That's when I saw him, just a glimpse at first in my peripheral vision. A figure standing in the corner near the bathroom, translucent but definitely there. When I turned to look directly, he became clearer. It was a man in his 40s, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, with thinning brown hair and a trucker's build. His face was gray-blue, like someone who'd been in the cold too long, and his eyes were wide with fear and desperation. "Howard," I whispered, and he turned toward me. His mouth was moving, but no sound was coming out, at least not from him. The sound was still coming from the radio, but now it was alternating between his voice and mine, creating this horrible chorus of two men calling for help from the same room, 47 years apart. "Help me," Howard mouthed, and I could see his breath in the freezing air. "I can't get out. I've been trying to get out for so long." The temperature gauge I'd been watching on the wall thermometer showed it was now below freezing, and I could feel ice crystals forming on my eyebrows and mustache. My fingers were going numb, and I realized that this wasn't just some supernatural experience. I was in real danger of freezing to death in this room. Howard stepped closer, and I could see the desperation in his eyes wasn't just fear, it was loneliness. He'd been trapped in this room, in this moment, for nearly 5 decades, reliving his death over and over, calling for help that never came. "I hear you," I managed to say through my chattering teeth. "I hear you calling for help. What do you need me to do?" For the first time since I'd seen him, Howard's expression changed from desperate to hopeful. Howard pointed toward the radio, then to the door, then back to me. He was trying to tell me something, but the cold was making it hard to think clearly. My hands were so numb I could barely feel them, and every breath felt like I was inhaling razor blades. The frost on the windows was getting thicker, and I noticed something that made my heart skip. The ice patterns weren't random. They were forming shapes, letters, spelling out words. "Answer the call." I looked at Howard, and he nodded frantically, pointing at the radio again. That's when I understood. For 47 years, Howard had been sending out that distress call, and no one had ever responded. Everyone who heard it either ran away or ignored it, thinking it was just some kind of recording or prank. But he wasn't just replaying his death. He was still actively calling for help, waiting for someone to finally answer him. My lips were turning blue, and I could feel my heart starting to slow down from the extreme cold. But I forced myself to walk over to that radio. The metal was so cold it burned my skin when I touched it, but I managed to find what looked like a talk button on the side. I pressed it and spoke into the radio, my voice shaky from the cold and fear. "Howard, this is Warren. I hear your call for help. I'm here in room 36 with you. What do you need?" The moment I said those words, the room erupted in chaos. The temperature didn't just drop. It plummeted so fast that the water in the bathroom pipes burst. sending ice shooting across the floor. The windows didn't just frost over, they cracked from the sudden temperature change, spiderwebbing with breaks that looked like lightning bolts. Howard's ghostly form became solid, real, and I could see the terror in his eyes as he relived that night in 1976. But something else was happening too. The radio was crackling with multiple voices now, not just Howard's and mine, but others. "This is dispatch, we have your location, Howard. Help is on the way." "Howard, this is Big Jim on I-55. I'm turning around to come get you." "State police are being notified, Howard. Hang tight." These were the voices he'd been waiting to hear for 47 years. The help that never came, the response to his desperate call. And somehow, by finally answering him, by acknowledging his cry for help, I'd opened a door for others to reach him too. The ice in the room began to swirl like a miniature blizzard, and I could feel something fundamental changing in the space around us. Howard looked at me with gratitude and relief, and for the first time since I'd seen him, he smiled. The voices on the radio kept coming, a flood of responses that Howard had been waiting decades to hear. "Howard, we're coming to get you, buddy. You're not alone. Hang in there, driver. Help's on the way to Richardson's Truck Haven." Each voice seemed to ease something in Howard's expression, like weights being lifted off his shoulders. But the supernatural ice storm in the room was getting worse. The frost wasn't just covering surfaces anymore. It was growing, spreading across the walls like living crystal formations. I could feel ice forming on my clothes, my hair, and when I tried to move, my joints felt stiff and sluggish. The cold was beyond anything natural, beyond what the human body could survive for much longer. Howard seemed to realize this too, because his grateful expression turned to concern as he looked at me. He raised his hand and pointed toward the door, then made a pushing motion, like he was trying to tell me to get out. But when I looked at the door, it was completely covered in a thick layer of ice, sealed shut like we were trapped in some kind of frozen tomb. The handle was buried under inches of frost, and even if I could reach it, my hands were too numb to grip anything. That's when Howard did something that probably saved my life. He walked over to the radio, and I mean walked, like he was as solid and real as I was, and grabbed the microphone. When he spoke into it, his voice came out clear and strong, not like the desperate, panicked calls from before. "This is Howard Welch, September 19th, 1976. I want to thank everyone who finally answered my call for help. I've been waiting so long to hear your voices, to know that someone cared enough to respond." The ice storm in the room began to slow down, the swirling crystals settling to the floor like snow. "Warren Mitchell, you did what no one else would do. You listened and you answered. But this isn't your fight anymore. You need to get out of here before it's too late." He turned to face me directly, and I could see that he was starting to fade again, becoming translucent. "The door will open now. The call has been answered and I can finally rest. But you need to leave immediately. This place is going to freeze solid for the next few hours as everything resets." As he said this, I heard the door lock click open behind me, and when I turned around, the ice covering it was melting away rapidly, steaming in the sudden temperature difference. I didn't need to be told twice. My legs were stiff and unsteady from the cold, but adrenaline kicked in and I stumbled toward the door. As I reached for the handle, I looked back one more time at Howard. He was almost completely transparent now, but he raised his hand in a wave, and I swear I could see peace in his face for the first time since this whole nightmare started. "Thank you, Warren," he said, though his voice seemed to come from far away now. 47 years is a long time to wait for someone to care. I grabbed the door handle. It was still ice cold but manageable, and yanked it open. The rush of warm September air hit me like a physical blow, and I practically fell out onto the concrete walkway. Behind me, I could hear the radio crackling one last time with Howard's voice. "This is Howard Welch signing off. Thanks for listening, good buddies. Over and out." Then silence. Complete, total silence from room 36. I looked back through the open doorway, and the room looked normal again. No ice, no frost, no radio on the table. Just a regular motel room with terrible carpeting and that musty smell. But the temperature was normal now, maybe even a little warm from the heating unit kicking in. I'm still shaking as I write this, and it's been 3 days since it happened. My wife keeps telling me to just forget about it, but I can't get it out of my head. We were driving back from my brother-in-law's wedding in Colorado Springs, and it was already past midnight when we hit the mountain roads. My 2 kids were knocked out in the back seat, and Sarah was dozing off in the passenger seat when I felt the car pulling to the right. That sinking feeling hit my stomach immediately, because I knew exactly what it was: a flat tire. Of all the places for this to happen, it had to be on some godforsaken mountain road with nothing but trees and cliffs around us. I pulled over at this little scenic overlook area. You know, the kind with those metal railings and a gravel parking spot where people stop during the day to take pictures. The whole place was pitch black except for my headlights cutting through the darkness. I woke Sarah up and told her what was happening, grabbed my phone to use the flashlight, and got out to assess the damage. Sure enough, the rear passenger tire was completely flat. I'm not the most mechanically inclined guy, but I know how to change a tire, so I popped the trunk and started pulling out the spare and the jack. That's when I noticed the van. It wasn't there when I first pulled over. I'm absolutely certain of that because I checked my mirrors like I always do. But now there it was, maybe 30 feet behind us, just sitting there in the darkness. No headlights, no engine noise, nothing. Just this beat-up-looking white van with tinted windows so dark you couldn't see inside. The weird thing was how close it was parked to us. Not like someone who just happened to stop at the same overlook, but deliberately close, almost like they were watching us. I called out, "Hello?" a couple times, thinking maybe someone else had car trouble too, but there was no response. Sarah noticed it too and asked me who it was, but I just told her I didn't know and to lock the doors. Something about the whole situation felt wrong. You know that gut feeling when your brain is telling you to pay attention? I tried to focus on changing the tire, but I kept glancing back at that van every few seconds. The windows were so dark I couldn't make out anything inside, but I swear I could see shadows moving around in there. Not like someone getting out or anything, just these subtle shifts, like people were repositioning themselves inside. My hands were already shaking as I worked on loosening the lug nuts, and it wasn't from the cold mountain air. I was trying to hurry up with the tire change, but those damn lug nuts were on there tight, and I kept fumbling with the tire iron because I couldn't stop looking back at that van. Sarah rolled down her window and whispered to me, asking if everything was okay, and I just nodded even though my heart was pounding in my chest. The silence was what got to me the most. No crickets, no wind, just this heavy quiet that made every little sound I made seem way too loud. When I finally got the flat tire off and started putting the spare on, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was the faint sound of a car door opening and closing, really soft, like someone was trying not to make noise. I froze completely and strained my ears, but I couldn't hear footsteps or voices or anything else. Just that one soft thud of a door. I looked back at the van and it looked exactly the same as before, but now I was convinced someone had gotten out and was somewhere in the darkness around us. I started working faster, practically throwing the tools around, and I told Sarah to start the car and keep it running. She could hear the panic in my voice because she didn't ask any questions, just turned the key and the engine came to life. The sound of our car running seemed to break whatever spell had been hanging over that place, and I swear I saw movement behind the van's windshield, like someone sitting up straighter or leaning forward. I got the spare tire on as fast as I could and just hand tightened the lug nuts. I figured I could properly tighten them later when we were somewhere safe. I threw all the tools and the flat tire into the trunk without even organizing them. Just wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. As I was walking back to the driver's side, I kept glancing at the van, and that's when I noticed something that still gives me chills. The van was positioned at just the right angle that if we tried to back out of our parking spot, we'd have to get really close to it or drive around it. It was like whoever was in there had deliberately parked to box us in or force us to get close to them. I got in the car, and Sarah immediately asked what was wrong because she could see how freaked out I was. I told her we needed to leave right now, and she started asking about the van, but I just put the car in reverse and started backing up. That's when the van's engine suddenly roared to life. No headlights came on, but I could hear that engine clear as day, and it sounded like a big V8, way more powerful than you'd expect from an old work van. I had to get pretty close to them to back out of our spot, and as we passed by their driver's side, I tried to look through their windshield, but it was just too dark. All I could make out was the silhouette of someone in the driver's seat, completely motionless, like they were staring straight ahead at nothing. The whole thing felt like some kind of standoff, and I knew we were in serious trouble. I floored it out of that overlook and onto the main road, my tires actually squealing on the asphalt. Sarah was asking me what the hell was going on, and the kids woke up from all the commotion, but I couldn't focus on answering anyone because I was watching my rearview mirror. Sure enough, maybe 10 seconds after we pulled onto the road, I saw headlights appear behind us. Not normal headlights, though. These were those super bright LED ones that light up everything like it's daytime, and they were getting closer fast. way faster than anyone should be driving on those winding mountain roads. I pressed harder on the gas pedal, taking the curves way too fast, and I could feel our car leaning into the turns. The kids were starting to get scared because they could tell something was wrong, and my 8-year-old kept asking why we were driving so fast. I told everyone to put their seatbelts on tight and tried to keep my voice calm, but inside I was panicking. Those headlights kept getting closer no matter how fast I went, and I realized this van had way more power than our little sedan. We were climbing up this really steep section of road with hairpin turns, and I was pushing our car harder than I'd ever pushed it before. The engine was whining, and I could smell something burning, maybe the brakes or the transmission, but I couldn't slow down because that van was right on our tail now, maybe 20 feet behind us. Then they started getting aggressive, really aggressive. The first time they bumped us, it was just a light tap on our rear bumper, but it was enough to jolt our whole car forward and make Sarah scream. I thought maybe it was an accident, like they were just following too close, but then they did it again, harder this time. The impact sent us lurching forward, and I had to fight to keep control of the steering wheel. My daughter started crying, and my son was asking if we were going to crash, and I was trying to drive and calm them down while this psycho in the van kept ramming into us. The worst part was the curves. Every time we'd come to a sharp turn with a steep drop-off, they'd get right up on our bumper and try to push us toward the guardrail. I'm talking about cliff faces that dropped hundreds of feet into nothing but rocks and trees. There was this one turn where they actually made contact and started pushing us sideways, and for a split second I thought we were going over the edge. I could see the headlights illuminating the drop-off next to us, and I swear I've never been so terrified in my entire life. Sarah was holding onto the door handle and the kids were both crying now, and I was just trying to keep us alive. I managed to gun it and pull away from them on a straightaway, but they caught up again within seconds. This went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 or 20 minutes. Every time I thought I'd lost them, those blinding headlights would appear in my mirror again. They seemed to know these roads better than I did, taking shortcuts or something, because sometimes they'd disappear around a curve and then suddenly be right behind us again when we came out of a different turn. I was running out of gas and running out of options. My car was making all kinds of awful noises. The engine was overheating, and I could feel the brakes starting to get spongy from all the hard stops and starts. Sarah was on her phone trying to call 911, but we had no cell service up there in the mountains. Just those stupid no-service bars that made me feel even more helpless. The kids had gone quiet, which was somehow worse than when they were crying, because I knew they were just terrified into silence. I kept trying to think of what to do, where to go, but every road seemed to lead deeper into the mountains with more curves and more cliffs. Then I saw it up ahead, this little break in the trees on the right side of the road with a small brown Forest Service sign. I couldn't read what it said in the darkness, but it looked like some kind of side road or trail. It was our only chance because I knew our car wasn't going to make it much longer, and I was scared they were going to succeed in pushing us off a cliff on the next turn. I made the decision in a split second. I didn't slow down or signal or anything that would tip them off. I just yanked the steering wheel hard to the right and flew into that forest road at probably 40 miles per hour. Our car bounced and lurched as we hit the dirt and gravel, and I could hear rocks pinging off the undercarriage. The road was barely wide enough for one car, with thick trees on both sides that scraped against our windows. I had to slam on the brakes because I couldn't see more than 10 feet ahead with just our headlights, and the road was full of potholes and ruts. Behind us, I heard the most terrifying sound. The van's brakes screaming as they tried to make the same turn we'd just made. There was this awful screeching of tires on asphalt that seemed to go on forever, and then I heard something that sounded like metal scraping against metal, like they'd hit the guardrail or maybe clipped a tree. Then everything went quiet except for our engine idling and all of us breathing heavy. I sat there with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white, just listening and waiting. Sarah was looking back through the rear window and the kids were asking if the bad people were gone. I told everyone to stay quiet and just listened for maybe 5 full minutes. No engine sounds, no headlights, nothing. It was like they'd just vanished into thin air. We sat there in that forest road for probably another 10 minutes, none of us saying a word. I kept the engine running because I was terrified that if I turned it off, it might not start again, and we'd be stranded out there. The silence was different now, though. Not the heavy, threatening quiet from the overlook, but more like the normal sounds of a forest at night. I could hear owls in the distance and the wind moving through the trees, Sounds that somehow made me feel a little bit safer. Sarah finally broke the silence and asked if I thought they were gone, and honestly, I didn't know what to think. Part of me was convinced they'd find another way around and be waiting for us when we came back out, but another part of me felt like whatever had just happened was over. I told everyone we were going to wait a little longer, then try to make our way back to the main road really carefully. The kids asked if we could call the police now, and I tried my phone again, but still no service. I realized we were going to have to get back to civilization before we could report this to anyone. Assuming we could even figure out what to report, what were we going to tell them? That a van chased us but we never saw who was driving and they disappeared into the night? I kept thinking about those shadows I'd seen moving around inside the van back at the Overlook and wondering how many people had been in there. Were they armed? What did they want from us? The more I thought about it, the less sense any of it made. Eventually, I put the car in reverse and slowly backed out of that forest road, checking my mirrors constantly for any sign of headlights. When we got back to the main road, I looked both ways multiple times before pulling out, but there was nothing. No van, no tire marks, no sign that anything had happened except for the smell of burned rubber in the air. We drove the rest of the way home in near silence, taking the main highways instead of the back roads, and I kept checking the mirrors every few seconds for the next 2 hours. When we finally got home around 4 a.m., I did a complete walk around of our car with a flashlight. The rear bumper was definitely damaged. There were scrapes and dents that hadn't been there before, and our spare tire was still only hand tight from my rushed tire change. Physical proof that the whole thing had actually happened and wasn't just some shared nightmare. I wanted to call the police right then, but Sarah convinced me to wait until morning when we'd had some sleep and could think more clearly. The kids went straight to bed, but Sarah and I sat up talking about it until the sun came up. We kept going over every detail, trying to make sense of what had happened and who those people were. The thing that bothers me the most is how they seemed to know exactly what they were doing, like they'd done this before. The way they positioned their van to box us in, how they knew those mountain roads well enough to keep up with us, the timing of everything. It wasn't random road rage or some drunk driver. It felt planned and deliberate. We filed a police report the next day, but the officer didn't seem very interested once we told him we never got a license plate number and couldn't describe the people inside. He took down our information and said they'd keep an eye out for reports of a white van in the area, but I could tell he thought we were probably exaggerating or misremembering details. It's been 3 days now, and I still can't stop thinking about it. I keep wondering what would have happened if we hadn't found that forest road, or if our car had broken down, or if they'd succeeded in pushing us off one of those cliffs. Were they trying to rob us? Kidnap us? Or was it something worse than that? The randomness of it is what scares me the most. We were just a family driving home from a wedding, and somehow we became targets for these people. I've been avoiding mountain roads completely now, taking the long way around even for short trips, and I catch myself checking my mirrors obsessively whenever I'm driving. Sarah thinks I should see someone to talk about it, maybe a counselor or something. But how do you explain something like this? How do you tell someone that you were chased by strangers through the mountains in the middle of the night and you have no idea why or who they were? The worst part is knowing they're still out there somewhere, maybe doing the same thing to other families. I've been checking local news websites every day to see if anyone else reports something similar, but so far nothing. It's like it never happened, except for the dents in our bumper and the fact that none of us can sleep through the night anymore. I just needed to write this down somewhere, get it out of my head, and maybe warn other people to be careful if they're ever driving alone on those mountain roads late at night. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. I've been driving trucks for over 15 years, and I thought I'd seen everything on these highways. Night shifts, weird passengers, drunk people flagging me down. You name it, I've dealt with it. But what happened to me last Tuesday night has me questioning everything I thought I knew about what's real and what isn't. I'm writing this because I need to get it out of my head, and maybe someone else out there has experienced something similar. I was hauling a load of furniture from Phoenix to Denver, running about 2 hours behind schedule because of a blown tire earlier that day. It was around 3 a.m. when I hit this really desolate stretch of I-25 in New Mexico. The kind of road where you don't see another car for miles and the only light comes from your headlights cutting through the darkness. I'd been fighting to stay awake for the past hour, chugging energy drinks and blasting the radio, but that stretch of highway has a way of making you feel like you're the only person left in the world. The rain had been coming down hard for about 30 minutes, making visibility even worse. and I was just focused on keeping my rig between the lines and getting to the next truck stop. That's when I saw him standing on the shoulder, completely soaked from the rain. At first, I almost didn't stop because you never know what kind of trouble you're getting into when you pick up strangers, especially at 3 a.m. in the middle of nowhere. But the guy looked absolutely miserable, just standing there in a thin jacket with his thumb out, and something about the way he was hunched over made me feel sorry for him. I've been stranded before and know how it feels, so I pulled over and rolled down my passenger window. He came jogging up to the cab and I got my first good look at him. Pale guy, maybe in his 30s with dark hair plastered to his head from the rain. His clothes were completely drenched and he was shivering pretty bad. When he climbed up into the cab, he brought this smell with him that I couldn't quite place. Not body odor exactly, but something musty and sweet, like wet leaves that had been sitting too long. He mumbled a quiet "thank you" and settled into the passenger seat, dripping water all over my floor mats. I asked him where he was headed, figuring I'd drop him off at the next town or truck stop, but his answer made me pause. He looked straight ahead through the windshield and whispered, "Don't stop until mile marker 37. His voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear him over the rain hitting the roof. I thought that was a weird way to put it, but I figured maybe he had someone meeting him at that specific mile marker or something. Mile marker 37 was still about 20 miles ahead, so I told him no problem and pulled back onto the highway. The cab got quiet after that, just the sound of the diesel engine and the rain, and I tried to make some small talk to break the awkward silence. I asked him what he was doing out there in the middle of nowhere, how long he'd been waiting, the usual stuff you ask hitchhikers, but he didn't respond to any of it. He just sat there staring straight ahead, completely still except for the occasional shiver from being wet. I glanced over at him a few times and noticed he hadn't even tried to wipe the water off his face or push his hair out of his eyes. It was like he didn't even notice he was soaking wet. After about 10 minutes of silence, I gave up trying to talk to him and focused on driving. That's when I started noticing some things that didn't sit right with me. First, even though he was dripping wet when he got in, there wasn't as much water on the seat as there should have been. I mean, the guy was absolutely drenched, but my passenger seat wasn't nearly as wet as it should have been from someone in his condition. And that smell was getting stronger, that weird musty sweetness that reminded me of something rotting. I cracked my window a little to get some fresh air, but it didn't help much. The thing that really started freaking me out happened about 15 minutes into the ride. I was adjusting my rearview mirror to check on my trailer, and I caught sight of my passenger in the reflection. Except I didn't. I could see my own face. I could see the back of my cab. I could see the headlights of a car way behind us. But where the hitchhiker should have been sitting, there was just empty space. Just the passenger seat looking completely normal, like no one was in it. I blinked hard and looked again, thinking maybe the angle was wrong or I was seeing things from being tired. But nope, still nothing. I turned to look directly at him, and he was definitely there, sitting right next to me. But when I looked back in the mirror, the passenger seat appeared empty. My hands started getting sweaty on the steering wheel, and I felt this cold knot forming in my stomach. I've heard truckers tell stories about weird stuff happening on night runs, but I always figured they were just trying to scare the new guys or had been driving too long without sleep. This was different though. This was happening to me and I was wide awake. I kept glancing between the hitchhiker and the mirror, and it was the same thing every time. He was physically there, but his reflection wasn't. I started thinking about all those old vampire movies where they don't show up in mirrors, but that seemed ridiculous. This was real life, not some horror movie. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong with this guy. I tried to focus on the road and just get through the next few miles until we reached marker 37, but my mind was racing. I kept stealing glances at him, looking for anything else that seemed off. His breathing was so shallow I could barely tell he was doing it, and his skin had this weird grayish tint to it that I hadn't noticed when he first got in. Maybe it was just the lighting from the dashboard, but he looked almost corpse-like now that I was really paying attention. The strangest part was how perfectly still he sat. No fidgeting, no adjusting his position, no normal human movements at all. Most people can't sit completely motionless for 20 minutes, especially when they're cold and wet, but this guy was like a statue. I started checking the mile markers obsessively, counting down until we'd reached 37, and I could drop him off and forget this whole thing ever happened. Mile 31, 32, 33. Each one seemed to take forever to reach. The rain was starting to let up a little, but the tension in the cab was getting thicker. I could feel sweat beating up on my forehead despite having the air conditioning on, and my heart was beating faster than it should have been. Around mile marker 34, I noticed he was starting to move slightly, just tiny little twitches in his fingers and a slight turn of his head. It was subtle, but after sitting perfectly still for so long, any movement was noticeable. I thought maybe he was getting anxious about reaching his destination, which would have been normal, but something about the way he moved seemed wrong, almost mechanical. Then we hit mile marker 35, and everything changed. The hitchhiker suddenly became animated, but not in a normal way. He started turning his head back and forth, scanning the interior of my cab like he was looking for something specific. His breathing got heavier and more rapid, almost like he was hyperventilating, and that smell got so much stronger I had to fight not to gag. It was like being trapped in a small space with something that had been dead for weeks. I rolled my window down further, but the smell seemed to be coming from him directly, getting worse by the minute. When we passed mile marker 36, he completely lost it. He started clawing at the walls of my cab, his fingernails scraping against the metal and plastic panels with this awful scratching sound that made my teeth hurt. He was whispering something under his breath, over and over, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. It sounded almost like he was speaking in a different language, or maybe just gibberish. His movements were getting more frantic by the second, and I could hear him breathing heavily through his nose like an animal. I told him to calm down, that we were almost to mile marker 37, but he didn't seem to hear me. He kept scratching and clawing at everything within reach. The door panels, the dashboard, even the ceiling of the cab. I was getting scared that he was going to damage something important or hurt himself, and I started thinking about pulling over before we reached marker 37. That's when he suddenly stopped moving and turned to look directly at me for the first time since he'd gotten in the truck. His eyes were completely black, not just the pupils but the entire eye. No whites, no iris, just solid black like looking into a deep hole. When he spoke, his voice was different too, raspier and deeper than before, like he had gravel in his throat. "Let me out," he said. And it wasn't a request, it was a demand. "Let me out right now." I told him we were less than a mile from marker 37, that I'd drop him off there like he'd asked, but he started getting more aggressive. He reached for the door handle and started pulling on it, even though we were still going 60 miles per hour down the highway. I hit the locks and told him he couldn't get out while we were moving, that it would kill him, but he didn't seem to care. He kept yanking on the handle and pounding on the window, leaving these wet handprints on the glass that looked darker than they should have been. The pounding was so loud I was worried he was going to break something, and I started slowing down, thinking maybe I should pull over and let him out before we reached marker 37. But something in my gut told me that would be a mistake, that I needed to get him to exactly where he'd asked to go. Maybe it sounds crazy, but I felt like there were rules to this situation that I didn't understand, and breaking them would be worse than following them. So I kept driving toward mile marker 37, even though every instinct I had was screaming at me to stop the truck and get this guy away from me as fast as possible. That's when the really horrifying stuff started happening. As we got closer to marker 37, I could see the hitchhiker starting to change in my peripheral vision. At first I thought it was just the lighting or my imagination, but when I forced myself to look directly at him, I saw that his skin was literally peeling away from his face and hands. Not like sunburn peeling, but like it was coming off in wet strips, curling back and falling onto the floor of my cab. What was underneath wasn't more skin. It was something dark and glistening, almost metallic looking, that seemed to shift and move on its own. I could hear this wet tearing sound as more of his human-looking skin peeled away, and that awful smell got so strong I started gagging. I had to fight to keep control of the truck because my hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the steering wheel. The thing that had been pretending to be a hitchhiker wasn't even trying to look human anymore. Its movements were completely wrong, joints bending in directions they shouldn't, limbs stretching longer than they were supposed to be. It was still clawing at the walls of my cab, but now I could see that what I'd thought were fingernails were actually these sharp, black talons that were leaving deep gouges in the metal. The sound was like nails on a chalkboard multiplied by 100, and I could feel it in my bones. I was maybe a quarter mile from marker 37 when it started making this noise. Not quite a scream, not quite a hiss, but something in between that no human throat could make. It was the most terrifying sound I've ever heard in my life, and it seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, not just from the thing sitting next to me. I could see mile marker 37 coming up in my headlights, maybe 100 yards ahead, and I knew I had to get there no matter what was happening in my cab. The thing that had been the hitchhiker was completely out of control now, thrashing around and making that horrible noise, and I could feel the truck swaying from its movements. As we got within 50 yards of the marker, something even worse started happening. The creature's body began to come apart. That's the only way I can describe it. What I had thought was some kind of dark, glistening skin underneath the human disguise started breaking up into smaller pieces, like it was made of thousands of tiny moving parts. At first, I thought maybe it was some kind of weird disease or something, but then I realized what I was looking at. Bugs. Thousands and thousands of small black insects that had somehow been holding together in the shape of a person. They started separating and flying around the inside of my cab, hitting the windows and the ceiling and crawling over everything. I could feel them landing on my arms and neck, and I was swatting at them while trying to drive, completely panicking. The sound was indescribable, like being inside a beehive, but angrier and more chaotic. Some of them were getting in my mouth and nose when I tried to breathe, and I was coughing and spitting, fighting not to lose control of the truck. I could barely see through the swarm, but I knew we were almost to marker 37, and some part of my brain was still focused on getting there. Just as my headlights hit mile marker 37, I yanked the steering wheel hard to the right and slammed on the brakes, pulling onto the shoulder as fast as I could. The truck skidded and lurched, and I thought for a second we might jackknife, but somehow I managed to get us stopped right next to the mile marker. The moment we came to a complete stop, every single bug in my cab suddenly stopped moving. For about 3 seconds there was complete silence. No buzzing, no crawling, nothing. Then they all started flowing out of the truck at once, pouring out through every crack and opening they could find. Some went out the windows I'd cracked earlier, some squeezed under the doors, and others seemed to just disappear through gaps I didn't even know existed. Within maybe 10 seconds, they were all gone, and I was sitting alone in my cab, breathing heavy and covered in sweat. The passenger seat was empty, like no one had ever been sitting there at all. No wet spots from the rain, no scratches on the walls where he'd been clawing, no sign that any of it had happened except for the smell, which was slowly fading. I sat there for probably 15 minutes, just trying to process what I'd experienced and make sure I wasn't losing my mind. My hands were still shaking, and I kept looking around the cab expecting to see bugs I'd missed, but there was nothing. It was like the whole thing had been some kind of hallucination, except I knew it wasn't. I'd felt those insects crawling on me, heard that inhuman screaming, seen that thing's skin peeling away. It had been as real as anything else in my life. I eventually got back on the road and finished my run to Denver, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I kept checking my mirrors obsessively, half expecting to see that thing sitting in my passenger seat again, but it never came back. When I got to the delivery point, I did a thorough inspection of my cab, looking for any evidence of what I'd been through. I found a few tiny scratches on the door panel that could have been from those claws, but they were so small they could have been there before. No bug bodies, no leftover smell, nothing that would prove to anyone else that it had really happened. I've been driving trucks for 15 years, and I've never experienced anything like that before or since. I've picked up hundreds of hitchhikers over the years, and they've all been normal people just trying to get somewhere. But this thing, whatever it was, knew exactly where it needed to go and exactly what mile marker to get out at. It makes me wonder if there are others out there, if this happens to other drivers on different stretches of highway. Maybe there are things that use our trucks to get from one place to another, things that can't travel on their own but need someone to drive them to specific locations. The thought of it makes my skin crawl, and I haven't picked up a single hitchhiker since that night. I know that probably makes me sound like a selfish bastard, but I can't risk going through something like that again. The weirdest part is that I've driven past mile marker 37 dozens of times since then, both during the day and at night, and it looks completely normal. Just a regular mile marker on a regular stretch of highway. But I always get this uneasy feeling when I pass it, like something is watching me from the darkness beyond my headlights. I've talked to other drivers about it, trying to see if anyone else has had similar experiences, but most of them just look at me like I'm crazy or tell me I need to get more sleep. A few older guys have hinted that they've seen strange things on night runs, but nobody wants to go into details. It's like there's this unspoken rule that you don't talk about the really weird stuff that happens out here on the highways. I've thought about reporting it to someone, but who would I call? The police? What would I tell them? That a bug monster disguised as a hitchhiker dissolved in my truck cab. They'd probably have me committed or take away my CDL. So I just keep driving and try not to think about it too much, but every time I see someone standing on the side of the road with their thumb out, I remember those black eyes and that smell of rotting sweetness. I drive right past them now, no matter how desperate they look or how bad the weather is. I tell myself I'm just being cautious, but the truth is, I'm terrified of picking up something else that isn't what it appears to be. If you're a driver reading this, just be careful out there. Not everything that looks human actually is.